Right, okay, folks, here we are back again. Another episode, and one that I probably should have done a while ago, to be honest. So this is an episode that was inspired by a conversation I had with a guy called Dawson Church on the topic of emotional freedom technique, or tapping. I can't remember the episode number. It's not my proudest episode, I've got to be honest, but it's back there somewhere if you want to go check that one out. And that was my sort of first foray into dealing with certain topics that I think, well, that are bollocks, basically, in the realms of psychology. And so I thought this was going to be an easy debate to have, that I was going to have this conversation and sort of show it for what it is. Because it talks about things like energies and ancient acupuncture and all things like that. And I'm not into it. I don't believe in that sort of thing. But then Dawson started to sort of bamboozle me with all these studies and this scientific evidence and that I couldn't refute and that put me on the spot. And especially in light of the way I was engaging with him, he actually ended up putting forth a pretty convincing argument. And it wasn't... well, let's put it this way. I got ripped to pieces by my audience for that one. They said I was too polite with him, I didn't challenge him enough, and I just didn't do a good enough job, basically. But it sort of left me wondering what to sort of do about this when we talk to people like this that are in the realms of mental health and psychology that claim to have these remedies to help people. And when we say to them, well, you know, it's rubbish and come on, produce the evidence. And then they do produce the evidence. And then you're sort of left thinking, well, God, this is awkward. You know, maybe I am wrong. Maybe this isn't snake oil after all. Maybe it really works. And I don't know. It was an awkward conversation for me, and it's why I've not delved back into the realms of pseudoscience so much. So today's guest is hopefully going to help teach us how to develop a sort of layperson's baloney detection radar, I guess. So my guest today is Professor Scott Lilienfeld. Scott is a professor of psychology at Emory University, famous for his work on personality disorders and psychopathy, as well as his efforts to debunk various myths and pseudoscience that populate much of popular neuroscience and psychology. He's a fellow of and executive board member of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and a consulting editor for Skeptical Inquirer magazine and the editor-in-chief of the Clinical Psychological Science magazine. He is the recipient of a number of awards, including the David Shakow Award for Outstanding Early Career Contributions to Clinical Psychology and the James McKean Cattle Award for Distinguished Achievements in Applied Psychological Science. He is the author and co-author of a number of books, including 50 Great Myths of Popular Psychology, Brainwashed, The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience, and Facts and Fictions in Mental Health. So, Scott, after that lengthy introduction, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Right, okay. As always, what I'd like to do first is just start by, if you could tell us a little bit about you, the origins of your interest in psychology, but then more specifically, how this penchant for skeptical inquiry came into being as well, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great question. Do you have a few hours? I could regale you with lots of stories, I think, but I'll give you the short story. I've always, personally, as I tell my students, I've always had sort of a love affair with psychology and never really lost it. So I think I've always loved psychology, partly because I've always loved mysteries, and psychology has always supplied me with an endless supply of mysteries. So I've always been fascinated with the workings of the human mind and why we act the way we do. And I went into a field called clinical psychology in grad school, which is the study of mental illness. And I was a bit naive because I went in assuming that most people adopted a fairly scientific approach to the subject matter. And I think maybe partway through my graduate education, I began seeing some things that surprised me. I began seeing a number of people who were intelligent, by the way, and well-trained, using techniques, both measurement techniques, that is, those that are designed to assess mental illnesses, diagnose mental illnesses, as well as treatment techniques that I didn't think were all that well supported. And that kind of drew me into the field of skepticism, which I didn't really know much about until maybe the late 1980s or so, when I was well into my graduate education. I then began reading up about the skeptical movement and skepticism more broadly, and I think came to realize that many people, myself included, are often drawn to ideas that aren't all that well supported. I think I was that way very much as a teenager. As I tell my students, I was a big believer in ancient astronauts, and I entertained the possibility of UFOs and ESP, and again, I haven't totally given up the possibility those things exist, but I'm rather dubious because I haven't seen much evidence yet. I might change my mind tomorrow. But I think that I came to realize that virtually all of us are drawn to the seductive charms of questionable science or pseudoscience. And I also came to realize that, unfortunately, some of us in some subfields in clinical psychology maybe weren't doing as good a job as we should of policing ourselves. And I then began to do some reading and then eventually writing on that topic, which I found interesting. Was not much valued by academic institutions, which tend to value more research publications and peer-reviewed journals. But I also found that despite the fact that institutions in the ivory tower didn't seem to care much about it, I also realized that these writings were actually having a big impact, or some of them were, on the general public. I would get letters from lay people, letters from attorneys, so on, saying that what I'd written had made a difference. So that convinced me I needed to keep going.
Right. Well, I mean, a good place to start with that is you've mentioned the word science there a couple of times in relation to the field of psychology. So I often get contacted by people that want to come on the podcast. They've got a book or a therapy or whatever that they've coming out with. And so I got one recently from a guy, and he's I won't name names, but basically he's combined the idea of mindfulness with running, and he's give it its own name. It's a new type of therapy, and he's doing quite well off it publicly. It seems to be catching people's imagination. And on his website, he claims that it helps with depression and anxiety, and particularly things like traumatic childhood experiences, things like that. So I said to him, emailed back, said fine, but I'm skeptical about mindfulness to begin with, but also when people talk about exercise in when it comes to mental health, they talk about it in very vague terms as well. So I said, look, if you can come on and substantiate some of this stuff, tell us the science behind it, how maybe the exercise affects the endocrinology, or the mindfulness and neuroscience, I'm happy to have you on. And then he said that probably not the podcast for him. We probably wouldn't have a very good conversation, because he said, I'm a therapist, not a scientist. And so I've got to be honest, Scott, that sort of thing kind of pisses me off, especially when we're talking about claiming to help people that have been traumatized, childhood trauma, which could be any sort of horrific or abhorrent act that someone's had doled out to them. But, never mind the science. It just works. I'm just a therapist. And I'm just wondering, to what extent are investigations into quote-unquote abnormal psychology, to what extent are they a scientific endeavour? And to what extent should therapists be scientists?
So those are all great questions. I would respectfully maintain that this person was creating a false dichotomy. I think it's perfectly appropriate to say I'm a therapist, I'm not a researcher. I think that's acceptable. I don't think it's acceptable to say I'm a therapist and not a scientist. Science is not an action, that's an approach, it's a way of thinking. Science, at least in my terms, I don't think there's a simple or straightforward definition of what science is, but I think science in general, it tends to be an approach that minimizes errors in our way of thinking. It's an approach that tends to compensate for our biases. And when I think of what we colloquially call the scientific method, I think it's really a set of methods rather than one method, but what we loosely call the scientific method, I would call the scientific approach, really is a finely honed set of tools, both research tools and thinking tools, for reducing errors in our inferences and for thinking more clearly about the world. Why is that important? If you're a therapist making claims, you should be acting scientifically, and you still can be a scientist even if you don't do a stitch of research. So you don't need to do research in a laboratory to be a scientist. Because if you're making certain claims about whether a therapy works, and one should be open to them. I'm not opposed certain claims about mindfulness and combining them with running might be a good idea. I don't know. Then it's incumbent on you. The burden of proof falls on you to back up all those claims with evidence. So saying I'm not a scientist is really a bit of a cop-out because it's up to him or her to justify those claims with convincing evidence. So to me, when I ask the question, or I am asked the question, what do I mean when I asked whether something is scientific? What I mean is, are the proponents of these claims using techniques that reduce their own risk for error and other people's risk for error?
You see, I'd get that from the perspective of just a general therapist, that you don't necessarily have to be a researcher. But do you think these people that, everyone's got their own theory nowadays, everyone's coming out with their own little therapy with a name attached to it. Do you think I seem to think that there's a certain level of responsibility there where if you're going to come out with your therapy with this fancy new name, there needs to be an original body of research behind that to back that up. Would you agree with that?
I do think that's true. And in science, we often call it the burden of proof requirement, or the onus of proof requirement. And there's some controversy about when to apply that requirement, but I don't think there should be much of any controversy that the burden of proof always falls on a person when they're making a claim about a new treatment that may entail some degree of harm or risk. One thing we used to think in the field of mental health, for example, is that at worst, mental health treatments, psychotherapies or medications were harmless and there was no risk associated with them. That's not true. There's growing evidence that at least a subset of therapies may in some cases be harmful, may make people worse. And moreover, even for treatments that are themselves harmless, you're asking people to invest a lot of time, energy, effort, sometimes a big chunk of their cash in a treatment. So ethically speaking and scientifically speaking, the burden of proof always falls on the proponent to make those claims. So it's a logical fallacy to say, oh, it's up to skeptics or up to doubters to prove me wrong. That's not the way science works. That's not the way the game of science operates. If someone makes a claim about a new therapy, the obligation goes both ways. We, who are scientists, have an obligation to listen to them, keep an open mind. Sometimes we don't do that very well, so sometimes we fall flat in that obligation. But their obligation is to try to back up their claim with compelling evidence. And if they don't, there's no particular reason why we should be obliged to listen to those claims.
What's your opinion just on that thing as a whole, which seems to be quite a new phenomenon? Maybe it's fueled by the internet and just how easy it is to put information out there. But what's your opinion on that in general, of this explosion of new therapies and where they're coming from and maybe what people's motivations are? Because my gut response to them all the time is, oh, for God's sake. And I just feel like I feel immediately sort of irritated by people that have got these new therapies and immediately skeptical and thinking you're just trying to have people's eyes out. You don't care about people. You're just after money. But that's me. That's an emotional reaction. But I'm just wondering, for someone that actually studies this as broadly and can probably take a more sober perspective of it all. I'm just wondering what you think of this whole movement.
Yeah, I'm not going to deny that I sometimes don't get a bit irritated too, but I try to step back and kind of put it in a broader historical context. First of all, I don't think it's new. The wacky therapies, unsupported things have been around for a long time. I think they're probably spreading more rapidly now because of the internet. So when someone comes up with a questionable or downright bad idea, maybe in the past it might take a couple of years to spread. Now it might take a couple hours to spread, given the internet and social media. So there is that danger. But the idea that in medicine and psychology there have been bad ideas that have caught on certainly is not anything new. I would argue on the optimistic side that there's one important way in which things are getting better, which is that there's much more of a movement in medicine and also more recently in psychology and psychiatry toward evidence-based practice.
Yep.
And that movement is really designed to try to produce practice guidelines and other kinds of guidelines to guide practitioners toward treatments that have been found to be reasonably effective in controlled trials. And more settings, institutions, training programs are putting emphasis on evidence-based practice and adopting what are sometimes called empirically supported therapies, ESTs, therapies that have been found to work in controlled trials. So I think there are definitely some dangers. There's some ways in which arguably things are getting worse, but I do think that there is an important way in which things are getting better. Now, why are these things popular? I suppose one could be cynical and say there are always some people who are ready to kind of hawk techniques that don't work and make an easy buck. And there's no doubt some truth to that in some cases. But I tend to be a bit more charitable. I tend to think the majority of these practitioners are trying to help, and the majority really do think their techniques work. They are, after all, relying largely on their anecdotal experience, their intuitions, and their objective, what they think are their objective clinical observations. They really are subjective, and concluding these techniques work. So they're seeing what they think is improvement with their own eyes. I think in some cases they are seeing improvement. In other cases they may not, or they may be being fooled or misinterpreting it. But I also think, in fairness to some of these practitioners, and I would disagree with many of them for sure, but in fairness to them, I think some of the popularity of these techniques no doubt derives from an unmet need. Even the most effective psychological treatments for things like major depression leave a large number of people, in some studies, majorities of people, with significant symptoms. And with depression, there are treatments that do seem to help, psychological treatments, but still many of these people do relapse. And some of these people, for reasons we don't really understand, don't seem to respond well to extant intervention. So there is an understandable sense of frustration, maybe even desperation, that standard medical treatments aren't, and psychological treatments aren't doing the trick. They aren't helping people as much as they should. And then I think people, though, sometimes then make a mistake of assuming, oh, therefore I'll try anything, or anything else can work better. That's the logical error, because that doesn't necessarily mean that some of these other treatments will work better. Some of them may not. Some of them may work worse. But I do think some of it is coming from a good place, or at least an understandable place, that people see that a number of people with these disorders are not getting the treatment they need. The problem is some of these interventions are also not giving them the help they need.
Okay, moving on. I'm going to stop picking on these sort of Twitter psychologists now, and just to sort of demonstrate the maybe the power of bad science to push ideas out there. I'm interested if you could give us maybe one or two myths or types of therapies or any kind of science, big ideas that are out there that seem to be persistent, where the evidence for them is terrible, where you sort of see these ideas and you're like, oh my God, this is bollocks, why can nobody see it? But regardless, no matter what the attacks are, it doesn't seem to go away.
Yeah, I'll give you one or two is challenging, because there are a lot of them out there. I'll give you two offhand that will no doubtly make some enemies among your listenership, but I think the evidence is now pretty persuasive on both counts. One that comes to mind offhand that's actually timely, because I've done some writing on it and have been involved with some colleagues on it, is a technique called facilitated communication, which is a very interesting technique for autism spectrum disorder, colloquially called autism, and other kinds of developmental disabilities. And a bit of historical background. Admittedly, the criteria for autism have broadened quite a bit, but way back when, in the 1990s, when I was beginning faculty member in grad school in the 1980s, autism was quite rare. Maybe was thought to be quite rare. Maybe one in 1,000, 1 in 2,000 cases, maybe even 1 in 10,000 cases. And also, it was thought to be a disorder that was often associated with marked intellectual disability, and large numbers of individuals with autism were unable to speak or had severe linguistic deficits. In fact, that's still true of some individuals with autism, particularly those with IQs maybe in below 40 or 50. Some of them do have a lot of linguistic problems. So way back then, in the early 1990s, Doug Bicklin, a professor of education at Syracuse University in our state of New York, imported from Australia a technique called facilitated communication. And the logic here is that individuals with autism, despite what all of us had thought, individuals with autism don't in fact have a mental disorder at all. They have a movement disorder primarily that renders them either incapable of speaking or have difficulty speaking. So all you need to do, according to this idea, is to seat a person with autism or a similar developmental disability in front of a keyboard or letter pad or typewriter, what have you, and with the aid of a facilitator who supposedly straightens out their arm and hand movements, provides a bit of resistance to their head movements, they can suddenly type out words, letters, sentences, paragraphs, pages with unerring accuracy. And this is what began to happen. It was really quite remarkable. People who, with autism, who were assumed to have IQs of 20s and 30, couldn't speak a word, suddenly were, with the aid of the facilitator sitting next to them, were able to type out pages and pages of eloquent language. And some of it, by the way, very moving and poignant. I mean, there were sentences like, "Mommy and Daddy, I love you so much. I've never been able to talk to you before. I can finally tell you how much I love you," and so on. And it's hard not to be moved by that. I mean, I've read some of this stuff. It's very heartbreaking, very moving, very poignant. This went on for quite some time, and facilitated communication, which I'll call FC for short, spread like wildfire throughout much of the United States and some other countries, especially in the U.S. It became a fad. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people were trained in it. And it was unfortunately too late, because by that time people had already been trained in it. People were using it. And when I say it was too late, what do I mean? What was too late was the research. All the research was finally done, which conclusively, in my view, and that of other people who looked at it, and there are now dozens of studies, show that FC is what we would colloquially call a Ouija board effect. The facilitator is, without even realizing it, guiding the individual's hands toward the desired letters, and the facilitators are almost always unconscious of it, unaware of it. It's actually a fascinating psychological phenomenon called the ideomotor effect. The ideomotor effect is where individuals' ideas can unknowingly control their movements. It's a fascinating effect, but it's been well documented in psychology for centuries, actually. And it's still going on. So FC was debunked in the mid-1990s. There were some TV programs in the U.S. that were devastating, that gave it a very bad reputation. Unfortunately, people often have short memories. So even though those TV programs and others got attention and FC kind of went into hiding, it's now making a comeback and is still very popular in some settings. And it's kind of clever, because the proponents of FC have often relabeled it. They know that FC, facilitated communication, got a bad name, and they know that bad name is out there. So they've often used different terms like supported typing or those kinds of things. They give it different names. Or there's another technique called rapid prompting method, which is related to FC, where the facilitator just holds up the board rather than guides the person's or touches the person's hands or arms. But it almost certainly works the same way, again, almost certainly through this ideomotor or Ouija board effect, despite the fact that control studies have conclusively shown over and over again that it's the facilitator who is unintentionally doing the typing. It has not dissuaded hundreds, if not thousands, of people from still using it and claiming that it works. And it's hardly a harmless technique. Not only does it take up a lot of time, energy, and effort, not only does it, in some cases, probably take kids and adults away from techniques that actually could teach them some better communication skills. And there are ways of improving the communication skills of individuals with autism and related disabilities. But it's also been found to be linked to a fairly large number, the exact numbers are difficult to come by, of uncorroborated and in some cases clearly false sexual abuse allegations against parents. So for reasons that are still unclear, there have been a number of allegations that were typically sexual in nature that were emitted by individuals with autism with the aid of the facilitator. We now know that those allegations were probably, in most, if not, I would argue, probably all cases, coming from the facilitator's mind, not the individuals with autism's mind. So that's one case. I can go on for hours about that one, but that's one case where we have, in my view, clear and convincing evidence that a technique does not work. We have a clear and convincing alternative explanation for how it seems to work. We have a clear and convincing explanation for how good, well-meaning, intelligent people are being fooled by it, and yet it is still being used, which I think is an ethical scandal. A second technique, I can actually pause there if you have any questions about that, but that's one that comes to mind.
I've got a million questions about that one, Scott, but I know we have to probably move on from it. Although I tell you what, I wouldn't mind doing an episode on that one. I'll have to seek out somebody that's maybe done a bit of research on that. I can
give you some names. I'll give you a couple of good names on that if you want. But number of good psychologists who have done work on it. Some other people, which I have not done, who have, I've just written one or two papers on it, but I have some colleagues who not only have done direct research on it, which I have not, but have also testified in court about it. So I can give you some names of those people. So it's really a remarkable technique. If your listeners ever want to watch a truly great video on it, it's now rather old, but unfortunately, it's still timely. And I say unfortunately because it would be nice to think it would be outdated, because nice to think the FC is no longer being used, but it's still as relevant as ever. But if you Google or go on YouTube the phrase "prisoners of silence," I believe it was 1994, did just a terrific 50-minute or so documentary on FC, facilitating communication. It was Frontline, which is a U.S. production, and it's just really remarkable. It's very, very powerful. It's also a wonderful demonstration of scientific research at its best, and using science to examine claims that people want to believe. When I show it in my classes, a number of students at the end are crying, and it's not only very scientifically powerful, but in many ways very emotionally powerful too.
Right, well, I'll definitely include that in the show notes, people. So don't forget to check those out.
The Prisoners of Silence. And that's an unsolicited endorsement. I'm not being paid a penny for it. But it's one I've shown many times in my classes. I recommend it to many others. And as far as I know, it's still up on. I haven't checked in a year or so, but as far as I know, it's still up on YouTube.
Okay, I'm wondering if there's anything maybe that relates to the zeitgeist at the moment. Mental health, it's the thing at the moment. Everyone's talking about it. You know, it's made its way to Hollywood. All the celebrities are on it and all that sort of thing. And it's depression and anxiety. They're the big ones. So I'm wondering if there's anything that's out there now that's a big idea that everyone's on, that everybody believes works, or there's evidence for something that they'd be shocked to hear. Well, actually, you know, it's not so simple.
Well, you mentioned mindfulness earlier, and by the way, I'm not close to mindfulness techniques. I think they have some promise. I mean, when I was in grad school, I was very stressed out, like we all were. So I used to practice informally meditation and so on. And I think some of mindfulness's popularity is that we live in a very stressful world now. We live in a world, at least in Western society, US, UK, we're all overworked and stressed out and underpaid, and always many of us are running around like chickens with their heads cut off. So it's understandable that we want to want some techniques that could calm us down, give us a bit more perspective on life. And by the way, I don't think it's a bad idea. I think it's good to be able to sit back and view one's life with a bit more perspective and not get too caught up with all the everyday irritations of life that we all fall prey to sometimes. I think the only thing I'd say about mindfulness techniques, first of all, it's a very vague very vague term. It refers to a very broad class of techniques. So that's one problem with mindfulness. There are often also different varieties of mindfulness. Some of them involve more paying close attention to one's stimulus, almost concentrating closely on what one is encountering. Others involve more almost distancing oneself from it, trying to view it almost from a distance, sort of objectively, and they're kind of lumped together. It's not clear they always should be lumped together. But my concern with mindfulness is not that I don't think it's worth looking at. I think it is. And I think some of the research is somewhat promising. But I also worry that it's being somewhat overhyped. I think the claims are running ahead of the data. In my reading, mindfulness techniques may have some promise, I think, for everyday anxiety and depression. And I think we should keep looking at them. And I have no problem with people choosing to practice them. My problem is that I think most of the data don't convincingly yet show mindfulness works better than other things out there. So,
yeah, I think one of the big sort of popular claims you hear is that mindfulness is equally as effective with depression and anxiety as things like antidepressants. I mean, they've got their own controversy around them, or things like CBT. Let's compare it to CBT as a general. If you was going to weigh the two up, is that a fair claim that mindfulness is as effective?
I don't think we know yet. I think, and it's possible it is. By the way, I'm not close to it. I don't think it's nearly as well validated or supported as cognitive behavioral therapy, though. I don't think the evidence base is quite there yet. That could change in a few years, but I don't think right now the evidence is nearly as clear as it is for cognitive behavioral therapy. One domain in particular, I mean, I wouldn't call myself an expert in the mindfulness area, but one area in particular that I think is going to be very important in comparing mindfulness, say, with cognitive behavioral therapy is not just treatment, but also prevention, prophylaxis. One of the things we know that CBT tends to do is it gives people skills. So it gives people skills for, in some ways, CBT I sort of think of as kind of the ultimate scientific approach to therapy, because it gives you critical thinking skills to evaluate, appraise, in some cases question, and even maybe debunk your own assumptions about yourself that can often lead to depression. So many people who are getting depressed have irrational beliefs about themselves. You know, they get one bad job evaluation and they conclude, oh, that's it. I'm a loser. I'm terrible. I'll never get another job, or because my boss doesn't like me, therefore no one else likes me, or because I got rejected on this date, no one will ever love me, or what have you. And you see that those kinds of irrational thinking processes, and CBT experts have given little cute names to some of these different errors. But CBT gives you skills for questioning these techniques later. And maybe partly because of that, CBT seems to be good not just for treating depression, but also warding off future depressions as well. Yeah. So that when people who are depressed start feeling depressed later, they can kind of remind themselves, oh yeah, I think I'm thinking that way again, and it can ward it off. Now, mindfulness may be able to do that too. It may also give people some skills for coping and seeing themselves in a more objective manner. So I think that's one thing that I find interesting about mindfulness techniques. They may actually give people a bit more perspective on things that may help them to not, for example, identify themselves with their thinking or emotion. That's one important lesson mindfulness teaches us, that we're not our thoughts, we're not our emotions. We can pull back from them a bit, but I think we will see. I think it's still too early to know whether mindfulness will show that same kind of promise.
Yeah, I think subjectively, I found trying to do mindfulness from the spiritual perspective, or as this huge cure-all that was going to fix all my problems, that was a frustrating experience. When I reined it in and just started to think about it as just sort of taking a conscious nap during the day, just taking the foot off the accelerator for 20 minutes, simplifying it like that, that's when it hooked me in a bit more then, just instead of yeah. And I think Dan Harris has written a book on it where called 10% Happier, and I think that's a perfect sort of perspective on mindfulness. If you just aim for 10%, you might achieve that. Whereas if you're going for the 100% or transcendental enlightenment or whatever it is, yeah, that's going to prove elusive.
Well, yeah, I think one or 2 points there. I think that's right. Real quick, I think number one, I think it's important scientifically to show that mindfulness does better than plain old relaxation. Relaxation techniques, I think, can be helpful. I used to teach them to my clients. I sometimes use them myself, and they can be quite helpful. So does mindfulness do better than plain old relaxation? We don't typically know. And the second point you raised, which I think is really crucial for people to understand, is that they should not go into these things with unrealistic expectations. These things are not cure-alls. I think mindfulness probably does take the edge off of things in some cases, and for some people, for those purposes, it can be quite helpful. But if people go in expecting that this alone is going to alleviate all of their depression by itself, that's probably not realistic. And I worry that may actually backfire, because people may end up trying a technique and they may feel, well, this is not working completely, or still leaving me with significant symptoms, therefore I'm going to stop using it, which would be, in some cases, a significant mistake.
Yeah, jumping back a minute, Scott, you mentioned, when I asked you to give us a couple of examples of these sort of persistent myths, you said that, one of these might make some enemies amongst your listeners. And so, again, little anecdote here. So the other day was a meeting, mental health support group, and during one of the discussions, one of the girls that was there, she struggles with depression. She started talking about antidepressants and how her taking antidepressants, she discovered that she's got a chemical imbalance. She hasn't got enough serotonin in her brain, and that these antidepressants, they fix that. And there was a professor of psychology was with us there that day, and he sort of said, well, hang on a minute. I can't sort of let you go ahead and just throw that idea out there to everybody in front of this group of people, because there's not actually any sort of hard evidence for this, and we have to be careful about talking about it in those terms. And she looked deeply upset by that. I don't know if she'd never heard that before, whether it was more of a personal thing because he'd stopped her in her tracks. But to me, it looked like this was the first time anyone with some sort of authority on the subject had said, well, there's actually no evidence for that. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, someone who does this for a living, debunking these ideas, I'm wondering what the ethics are of doing that. When you've got people that believe in antidepressants or people that believe in tapping, that maybe they've had I've met people that have had these awful traumas in childhood, and they say tapping, it cured me. And this part of me wants to go, well, hang on a minute. But then there's an ethical issue there where, look, if it helps that person, shut your mouth, don't say anything. But that's okay for me in an interpersonal setting. But for you as a scientist, what's your view on the ethics of debunking ideas?
Yeah, these are great questions you raise, and they're ones I struggle with a lot. Let me give you a 30-second specific answer, then I'll try to give the broader answer. The 30-second specific answer, by the way, which maybe isn't directly relevant to your question, but I do feel obliged to mention it, is that antidepressants do work a bit, by the way. I think they can be effective, especially for mild and severe depression. They are overhyped too, but they probably have a good 25-30% edge above and beyond placebo sugar pills, so they are helpful. Your psychologist friend is probably correct that it's probably either not true or grossly oversimplified to think that they simply correct a chemical imbalance in the brain. They may correct some kinds of subtle imbalances at the neural level, but they don't certainly. It's not merely that there's not enough serotonin and these medications just boost them up. It's sort of an appealing metaphor, but it's probably wrong. Now, getting back to the broader question about the ethics, it's a tough one because if people believe something is helping them, should we disabuse them of that belief? Here's my take. I think sometimes we make the mistake as skeptics and debunkers of just taking things away without giving anything back. And I think we have to be careful not to do that, because sometimes people are obviously looking for some hope, and maybe this technique, whether it's effective or not, is giving them hope. And if we merely pull the rug out from under them without giving anything back to them, I do think there's some ethical problems with that. On the other hand, and this is the thing I struggle with, on the other hand, I also think it's unethical for us to keep our mouths shut and not correct misconceptions. So I think it's important for people to understand that the techniques they're using may have, in fact, been helpful to them. It's possible. We don't know. But that the scientific evidence may not be quite as clear as some people claim. And if someone believes tapping is helping them overcome their abuse, it's possible. I may not rule it out. I'm doubtful, but it's possible. But I think it also would be useful to tell those people that the technique they're undergoing may have actually been helpful to them, but it might not have been the tapping. So they might have assumed it was the tapping procedure itself, but in fact, I might sort of gently raise with them, very tactfully, the possibility is it possible that the technique really is helping and you're feeling better as a result of it? But I think it's also possible that maybe there were some other things that the therapist was doing other than the tapping that were also helpful, which in some ways could be optimistic because it could imply to them actually there may be a number of techniques that could actually be helpful. So you might not want to necessarily limit yourself to just tapping techniques. So give you one example. During a lot of these techniques that involve tapping to supposedly readjust bodily energies and so on. Very, very often what's going on here is that the therapist is skillfully guiding the client to think about upsetting imagery, traumatic imagery in their heads at the same time. And we know from many, many studies that those kinds of exposure-based techniques, they're called, that encourage clients to mentally expose themselves, think about the things that upset them, are themselves curative or helpful, therapeutic, so that the tapping itself may be helpful. I'm doubtful, but alternatively, in my view, more plausibly, maybe it's just a kind of window dressing that has nothing to do with the improvement at all. And I think it's important to let clients know in non-technical terms that, yeah, the technique may be helpful, but it may be helpful for reasons other than they think. and they might want to give some thought to that because it might make them realize, maybe it's not so much the tapping. Maybe it's more that I need to confront the fears that I've had. Maybe what this technique is doing is it's kind of forcing me to think about things that I've put out of my head for a long time, skeletons in my closet that I was afraid to confront. And now I'm actually confronting them. And that's really what is therapeutic.
Yeah, to be fair, that is when I spoke to Dawson Church about it, those were the exposure elements of it were what he was citing as the curative effect of it. But every time even though he talks about energies and the acupuncture points, every time I tried to pin him down on that, that's where he was sort of talking around the questions and wanted to avoid those aspects of it. So,
well, he may have been right, though. I mean, ironically, he may have been correct that this technique was working to an extent, because if he's using exposure-based techniques systematically, his techniques may well be working, but for very different reasons than the way he thinks he works. Yeah. So then the question, of course, becomes, why then do you need to get trained in tapping and advertise yourself as a emotional freedom therapist and give workshops in emotional freedom techniques and so on, when in fact you could just do it the simpler way?
Okay, so big question, this one, I think, and this will relate back to some conversations I've had in the past. So I've interviewed Joanna Moncrief in the past, who is skeptical of the disease-centered model around antidepressants.
Yep. I'm familiar with her writing, yeah.
And then I've spoken to a guy called William Epstein as well. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work.
Not sure.
His was one of the most sort of revelatory conversations I've ever had on this podcast, because he was very skeptical about some of the methodology used to study various psychotherapies. And so when I was interviewed Joanna, she mentioned the idea of the disease-centered model of antidepressants and the biological conception of depression. And she used the word that when I said, why can't people get away from that? She said that a lot of people, academics, researchers, they want to believe the biological conception of depression. And then with William Epstein, he was saying that, these people that are guilty of sort of massaging the figures of various studies, and those aspects of research confuse me. And I'm wondering what you think are the motivations for people making misleading claims when it comes to evidence in psychological studies, whether is it misleading on purpose? Is it big pharma's influence? Is it what is it, Scott? Because it doesn't. Yeah,
I think it's probably very complex. I mean, probably a lot of reasons. By the way, I'm not probably as anti-biology as some others are. I think depression is clearly partly a biological illness. There's no question there's a biological genetic disposition toward depression, but I also think it's much more than just a biological illness too. There are definitely environmental triggers, and no doubt the biological level of analysis is one key one, but it's not the only one. Now, why do people overstate things? I think I'm the older I get, the more charitable I get. I no doubt that some people are motivated by big pharma and their financial conflicts of interest. That's part of it, but I think some of it's a function of training. So, not surprisingly, people who are in psychiatry, who tend to have more medical training, sort of see the world more through that lens. And it's not an invalid lens. I think, again, I'm not as anti-psychiatry as some of my colleagues are. But I also think, as Abe Maslow and others have said, once we have a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. And once you have a very powerful biomedical lens by which to view things, you may then end up either missing or selectively reinterpreting other kinds of data. So I think a lot of it is probably what we call confirmation bias. People come in with very strong preconceptions and biases, and then either dismiss evidence that doesn't support their views or selectively reinterpret it and sort of shoehorn it so it fits in their views, regardless of whether it really belongs there.
That goes against everything that science seems to be about for me, though, and I just feel like surely the truth matters. I mean, I like to think that if I'd managed to get into academia, that if I had a theory, a hypothesis, and I tested it, and it came back that it was just complete nonsense, and I was completely, off the reservation with it, that'd be just as exciting as finding out that I was right, because it takes you one step closer to the truth. And I don't know.
I think that too. Yeah, that's a nice way to view things. I wish science were that way too. And And I was idealistic that way too. But data show that scientists are probably just as prone to confirmation bias as everyone else, and scientists are invested in their theories. They sometimes they're financially invested, but even when there isn't money involved, they're personally invested. They may have been doing research on a theory for years or decades, and they want to believe it, and so they're prone to it too. I think we have to make a distinction between science and scientists. I think science is a kind of set of safeguards, not perfect, but a set of safeguards against bias, including confirmation bias. But that doesn't mean scientists individually are immune from confirmation bias. That's the reason we need science, actually. Ironically, the reason we need science is because scientists themselves are biased and flawed, and we need science to keep them honest and protect them against themselves. So the thing that's wonderful about science, as I teach my students, is science is really wonderful because it's a set of tools developed by scientists to protect themselves from being fooled. So scientists have developed science because they themselves know, you know what, I better use these techniques to keep myself honest.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question. Protecting oneself from being fooled. And maybe there's, one thing I found in this podcast is when you actually get past the pop psychology, this idea of quick tips and techniques often tends to fall flat. But I'm hopeful that there is maybe a few bits of tips and advice that you would have for people that would sort of inoculate them from baloney, so to speak. And in the context of, not everyone's going to want to go onto PubMed and read all the studies, but just how people can maybe analyze something at face value and go, maybe this isn't everything it claims to be.
Yeah, I can go on for a few hours about that one. It's a great question. Are there some tips? I do think there's some sort of heuristics or shortcuts that people can sometimes use. We know there's written about them a bit. So I don't think any of them are foolproof, but there's some things one can ask. So one can ask, is the finding replicable? One thing we've learned in psychology is that some of the findings that we thought could be independently replicated cannot. So I think one lesson from modern science is don't get too excited about initial finding until it's been replicated. And also, just as important, if not more, make sure it's been independently replicated, that is replicated by different teams, because some research teams may have the same biases and keep reproducing those same biases in study after study after study. So it's important for different research teams to replicate the finding. That's one important claim. Another key heuristic is alternative explanations. That's, of course, something that's hard to come by. It comes with scientific training, and you have to know a field well to know that. But one key question to ask is, are there alternative explanations that I've not considered that could also account for these results? That's really, really important, because what we see with the naked eye may not be everything. So that's, I think that's exceedingly important.
Are there any sort of, rather than sort of lenses to look at these things through, are there any sort of, I was going to say, does bullshit have symptoms, so to speak? Telltale signs?
Yeah, we know there's written about that. So we know there's Mario Bunga has written about this. We've written about this. A few others, John Russo, have written about this as sort of warning signs of pseudoscience. And they're not perfect, but there's some that we've talked about. So a couple of ones that we've talked about, for example, are over-reliance on anecdotal or testimonial evidence. Anecdotal data can be helpful initially, but it's not usually very helpful for concluding the treatment works. It may be useful for wanting to investigate a treatment, but we often see an over-reliance on anecdotes. We often see an over-reliance on, in psychology, what's sometimes called psychobabble, kind of hyper-technical language that doesn't really seem to amount to very much. That I think is another warning sign. Another good one is kind of a failure to self-correct. That is sort of a tendency, no matter what the data are, no matter how negative they are, the proponents of these techniques just kind of keep propounding them. Another one we know there's talk about, this is a bit technical, but I'll use a technical term and then explain it, an overuse of ad hoc hypotheses. What I mean there is an overuse of sort of escape hatches or loopholes to explain away negative findings. So it's very easy when a finding doesn't come out the way you want to kind of come up with an excuse after the fact, like, well, okay, yeah, there were 3 studies that didn't show my technique worked, but maybe the therapists weren't well trained enough, or maybe you didn't use it on the right clients, or maybe there was a noise in the other room so the clients couldn't hear the technique very well, or maybe, I tested it on people in the UK from London, but you're testing on people from Manchester. Maybe it's different in those people. You can come up with all kinds of excuses later. And, it's possible some of those things are true, but the problem is ultimately, again, it's a burden of proof requirement. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you to say, okay, well, now fix the study and do it the way you want and show that it works. So there are a number of these warning signs. None of them are perfect, but the more of these warning signs you see in conjunction, the more skeptical you should be that maybe we're looking at something that's a little suspicious, a little fishy here.
Oh, again, I think that might have to be an episode all of its own. A little,
absolutely.
Yeah, a guide to baloney detection or something like that.
There actually are some of these. So Carl Sagan in his book, The Demon Haunted World, 1995, I think, has a thing like that called a baloney detection guide, and Michael Shermer has something very similar. I think you get on the web. Both Shermer and Sagan have baloney detection kits. The exact words and indicators differ a little bit, but there's a fair amount of overlap in the kinds of things that they're talking about.
Okay, Scott, my final question is confession time now. So despite being a scientist, despite being someone that is invested in evidence, the evidence base of things, I'm wondering if there is anything that, whether it's psychology or elsewhere, any ideas to which you subscribe on the basis of faith more than evidence?
Sure. Oh, lots. And by the way, I see nothing wrong with faith so long as one is honest about it. I believe my wife loves me. And that's a faith-based belief. I mean, some of it's evidence, but at some point, when it comes to,
I never thought of it like that.
When it comes to love, I mean, there's some evidence, I hope, but when she says I love you, I guess that's sort of evidence. But at some point, you kind of have to have faith, right? And so I think that's certainly one belief. I'm different from other scientists. I would consider myself an agnostic, but I'm not totally closed to the possibility that God exists. I'm very dubious that there's a old man with a gray beard in the sky looking over everything I do. I think I give a very, very low probability of that. But I think in a weird way, I thought of writing a piece on this, but I haven't been able to put my thoughts together as coherently as I'd like. In a weird way, psychology has made me more skeptical of a kind of very anthropomorphic God, because I think our reason is that I think psychology has taught me that our minds can really create imaginary agents in our head when they're not there. And psychology has made me very dubious that there's a God very much like us out there. But on the other hand, it's also made me maybe a bit more open to the possibility of some kind of God like Spinoza and Einstein, and that I've also realized that I have my biases like everyone else, and that I think I'm smart, but in reality, and I think we're smart, but in reality, maybe we're really kind of dumb. Maybe our brains are so darn puny compared with some higher level intelligence that maybe there's something out there that we just cannot possibly grasp, so that there's some deeper purpose and meaning to it all that not only do I not grasp, maybe we will never be able to grasp. So do I think that's likely? No, but I don't totally rule it out or scoff at it the way some of my academic colleagues do.
Okay, Scott, brilliant. Is there any, have you got any links, any work, anything you're currently working on, social media, anywhere you'd like to direct the listeners?
Yeah, good point. I'm pretty bad about that. I'm a kind of old-fashioned kind of guy, so we don't do too much social media work. But we do. You mentioned our 50 Myths book. I'm very proud of that. For people who are interested more in clinical psychology, we edited a book with my friend Stephen J. Lynn and Jeffrey Lohr called Science and Pseudoscience and Clinical Psychology. It was published by Guilford in 2013, 2014. So people are interested in sort of learning about some of these warning signs of pseudoscience and how they apply to clinical practice, whether it's in clinical disorders, whether it's autism or depression or anxiety disorders. Our book, Science and Pseudoscience and Clinical Psychology, may be one thing people could check out.
Okay, as always, I will include links to those in the show notes. Scott Lilienfeld, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. Enjoyed it a lot.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode or you're enjoying this podcast in general and you'd like to help support it, this is just a quick message to let you know that you can now join our little exclusive members-only community over at Patreon, where for as little as $2 a month, you can gain access to exclusive content like the quickfire questions portion from my interviews and my AMA or Ask Me Anything episodes. There's also a members-only newsletter where I give you a little sneak peek into what kind of guests and content to expect over the coming weeks. You can help me steer the ship a little bit by telling me the kind of content you'd like me to produce, and there's also the opportunity to join a private Facebook group where you can interact directly with myself and fellow patrons to share tips and advice and support one another on your own mental health recovery journeys. So if this sounds like a community you'd like to be a part of, please go to patreon.com/myownworstenemy and sign up for as little as $2 a month, which, let's face it, is less than the price of a coffee, and not even one of them like fancy double Belgian chocolate latte bollocks. It's probably cheaper than like a plain old shitty Nescafe from the office vending machine, and it won't give you the jitters or make your breath smell of arse, so bargain. Alternatively, for those of you who do want to help support the podcast, but you can't be arsed with all the extra bells and whistles, you can make a standard one-time or monthly donation by going to our support page at myownworstenemy.org/support. And that's about it. So, as always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.